following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you may be listening and wherever you may be. Welcome to the program called Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall. I'm your host for this program, and if you are among our regular listeners, you know that I talk about a wide variety of subjects, but among those I keep returning to are baseball and books about baseball and my all-time favorite team, the Brooklyn Dodgers. So our guest today is an absolute natural for the program because he has written a wonderful new book about Brooklyn Dodger history, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I want to say hello and welcome, and thanks for joining us, John Zinn.
Thank you, Claire. I'm glad to be part of it, and thanks for having me.
You are most welcome. So your new book is called Charles Ebbets, and I think the subtitle starts to tell us, if we don't know who Mr. Ebbets was, but the man behind the Dodgers and Brooklyn's beloved Ballpark. So if you would, kind of give us a little broader picture of exactly who Charles Ebbets was, what his significance was to the history of Brooklyn Dodgers and of baseball.
Charles Ebbets was a baseball lifer and a Brooklyn Dodger lifer. He was a charter employee of the Brooklyn, and I'm going to use the term Dodgers, even though they were not called that for the first part of the first 25 years or so of their existence. But he was a charter employee. He was there on May 10th, 1883, when the team that became known as the Brooklyn Dodgers played its first game. He had almost like a 15-year apprenticeship, working from being a game day employee to being the club's secretary. And then when Charles Byrne, who was the founding president of the Dodgers, died in early 1898 rather, Ebbets became a minority stockholder and the president, and he remained president for the rest of it, literally until the day of his death in April of 1925.
And, that's just something that I think most people couldn't even imagine today, somebody going to work in the front office of a baseball team and working his way up to owner.
Well, part of that, of course, at the time is that they were much small. Baseball clubs were much smaller operations, a very small business with very few employees. Ebbets was one of those, though. There was no real career path, and you just worked your way up. And he, part of it was his own ability, and part of it was just, I think, some fortuitous circumstances that he became Charles Byrne's right-hand man, and one of his major accomplishments before he became Dodger president was in terms of schedule making. The schedule was, at the time, the owners considered it the most important thing that they took action on, because baseball clubs at the time, their sole source of revenue were ticket sales. There's obviously no radio, no television, very little in terms of sports merchandise. And so what the clubs want is they want the best possible dates at home to attract crowds, which is complicated by the fact that in the East, Sunday baseball is against the law. And also you're subject to some extent to the railroad timetables and the ability to move teams from one city to another. Before Ebbets got involved in it, there's records of some of the owners' meetings based on the schedule going to 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning, arguing over who's going to get the prime dates of the holidays and things like that. Byrne becomes as an owner, becomes part of the scheduling committee and brings Ebbets into it. And Ebbets had a genius for it, and he got it to the point where it was a science, and the schedule was adopted almost without any debate whatsoever. He had the both obvious and radical idea of the way that you deal with debate over who gets the holidays is you just alternate them year to year. So if one club was home for 2 of the 3 holidays in one year, they would be home for only one the following year. And no one else seemed to have thought of that, but he came up with it, and it was accepted almost right away.
And, the scheduling, that was certainly one of his important innovations that he brought to the game, but not the only one. And could you talk about some of the others he was responsible for?
Sure. There's a number of things that he's responsible for that still continue today. One, literally one of his last contributions to baseball was the format of the World Series, the 2-3-2 format, which was introduced right about the time of his death and was in 1925 and was his idea and has continued ever since. But by far, I think his major contribution, not just to baseball, but to all professional sports, is the draft. At the time, the only draft that they had in baseball was the minor league draft. There was no amateur draft. And the minor leagues were all independent clubs. There was no farm system. Teams didn't have their own farm systems. And under the national agreement, major league clubs had the right to draft a certain number of players from each minor league team. It's continued today as what's known as the Rule 5 draft today. But the way it worked when Ebbets got involved is that draft positions were assigned by lot. So the New York Giants, who were the dominant team of the era, they could just as easily have the first draft choice as the Dodgers if the Dodgers were one of the worst teams. And that certainly did nothing for competitive balance. Ebbets, it's a complicated story because there's a lot of other factors, but Ebbets started fighting to change the draft and ultimately got to the point where what he advocated for is what I call the reverse order draft, where the team with the worst record gets the first draft choice. And it took a long time for it to be adopted or to be put into practice, but he fought for that, and then he gradually moved that same concept to waivers and other things so that whether he had a good team or not, he was interested in trying to help build a competitive balance because he argued that baseball, all the teams were better off if the league was competitive rather than being dominated by one or two. And that draft system is now the staple of every professional sport. And we take it for granted. We don't think there's anything radical about it, but it took him a long time to get the idea across.
Yeah, amazing what innovative thinking this man had in so many areas. I mean, how about the rain check as we know it today, another Charles Ebbets innovation?
Right. Well, of course, that's one of his innovations has now gone by the boards. But
right.
At the time, what happened is you would go into the ballpark and you would buy your ticket and you would turn in your ticket, your entire ticket. And then if the game got rained out before 5 innings were played, then you had to pick up a rain check on your way out of the park in order to get back in for the rescheduled game. And they would hire little boys to give out the rain checks, and it was people would have to wait online. It was a real disaster. So Ebbets came up with the idea of the ticket that you tear in half and you keep the half of it. That's the rain check. And if the game is rained out, then that's how you use it to redeem it for another game. Now, of course, with the advent of scanners and barcodes, they don't use that anymore. But that existed for a long time.
I mean, decades and decades.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this is not, I want to ask maybe now for you to step away from Charles Ebbets just for a few minutes and maybe talk about, well, in part, how you became interested in writing his biography and the fact that this is not your first book focusing on an aspect of Brooklyn Dodger history. So please take that away.
Sure. I became a baseball fan in the mid-1950s when I was about 10 years old. And my parents were Brooklyn Dodger fans, and I grew up in northern New Jersey, and to my knowledge, they went to Brooklyn once in their entire lives. So I don't know. I never asked, and I don't know why they were Brooklyn Dodger fans. They were certainly in the minority. But they were Brooklyn Dodger fans, so I became a Brooklyn Dodger fan. And at the same time, I also became very interested in baseball history, and especially the dead ball era, the period between 1901 and 1919. And so when I started to write I wrote 2 books about the Dodgers. I wrote one and edited one
with
my son. And the first one was about, I wanted to do something about the dead ball era. I wanted to do something about the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so the season that made the most sense was 1916, the first season that the Dodgers play in the Modern World Series. And my son and I did that book. Then our publisher was McFarlane and Company, and shortly after that, they announced that they were doing a series of books on historic ballparks. The first one was Ebbets Field in Pittsburgh, and then they were looking for somebody to do a book on Ebbets Field, and it seemed natural to us that we had done this other book, so we applied and we were given the contract to do that book. And in that book, it seemed only logical that if you're going to write a book about Ebbets Field, that you need to devote at least an essay or a chapter to the man who built it. And I took on the task of writing the chapter about Charles Ebbets. Everything that I had read about Ebbets before that, there's a consistent picture of Ebbets as being a bumbler, somebody who sort of muddles his way along, that when he succeeds in spite of himself, and he always succeeds in some kind of comic way. The best example I can give is that you'll find this story in almost every book about Ebbets Field and the Dodgers, is that when Ebbets built Ebbets Field, he forgot to include a press box or forgot to make any provision for the press. When I started researching the essay, which obviously is a lot shorter and a lot less intense than a book, I found that portrait of Ebbets was really not accurate. And specifically, that one story, it's true that Ebbets Field, when it was built, did not have a press box. But it wasn't because Ebbets forgot the press. He provided for the press in a section of the upper deck, which was not uncommon for the time. And a contemporary newspaper, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, about the time Ebbets Field opens, compliments him for the wonderful job he did in providing for the press. So it seemed to me there was more here than this image that had endured, and so that really got me interested. That, plus the fact I was interested in what it was like to be an owner in the dead ball era. So that's how I got started on the project.
Now, let me ask you, maybe talking about Ebbets Field is a good way to lead back to Charles Ebbets, and of course, even maybe a casual fan who doesn't know much about, 19th and early 20th century baseball history. At least they know the name from Ebbets Field, but that was not the first ballpark that Charles Ebbets built as the Dodger owner. So maybe if you would talk about first the predecessor of Ebbets Field and then Ebbets Field itself.
Sure. One of the major responsibilities of any owner is to provide an accessible and attractive venue for the fans. And when Ebbets took over the Dodgers in early 1898, he was only a minority owner, but he was the president. He had a ball club that wasn't very good, and he had a ballpark that wasn't very accessible. The Dodgers played in Eastern Park in East New York, which, according to one contemporary sports writer, if you went to a game, you had to miss both lunch and dinner in order to get there and back. And so one of the first things he has to turn his attention to is the ballpark. He's hampered by the fact that he doesn't have much time because it's only 4 months to opening day, and he doesn't have a whole lot of money. But he manages to build. It's actually the second incarnation of Washington Park in the Park Slope section of Brooklyn, and he does this one right. He made a serious mistake with Ebbets Field, which we can get to, but. First thing he did with Washington Park was he arranged the financing. He didn't have the money to do it himself, so he persuaded the local subway companies in Brooklyn to provide the financing because they had the incentive of it would be more traffic for them going to and from the games. But it took him from early January until the middle of March to get that in line. Once he had the financing in place, he's only got 45 days to build a ballpark, which is obviously, how could you possibly do that? Well, the only advantage of the wooden ballparks was that it didn't take very long to build them. Yeah. And the site for Washington Park was level It didn't have much in the way of demolition or site preparation, and he was fortunate enough to have some good weather. And so in a period of 45 days, they were able to build this new wooden ballpark with a capacity of about 12,000 for about 12,000 people. And he improved on it and renovated it over the course of its 14, 15-year existence. So it's not a lot of attention is paid to it because obviously everybody remembers Ebbets Field, but Washington Park, the one he built, was certainly a real accomplishment. One of the things that I try to do with an image in the book is give a sense that it was a big ballpark. It was wooden. I mean, it wasn't a nice ballpark, but it was as we would define it today. But it certainly wasn't, by the standards of the day, small.
Yeah, but by the early part of the 20th century, Ebbets, and certainly he wasn't the only baseball owner at the time, was dreaming of something, I guess, could we say, much bigger still, more permanent and grander?
Sure. What happens is that in that first decade of the 20th century, there are some refinements in building, especially the introduction of reinforced concrete, which is nothing more complicated than steel bars inside cement. And what that does is it enables the owners to build ballparks that are bigger and more safer. They're not flammable like the wooden ballparks were. And the era of those ballparks begins in 1909 with Shibe Park in Philadelphia and Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, and it runs through the beginning of the building of the first Yankee Stadium in the early 1920s. Ebbets' turn comes about he starts acquiring land before that, but he announces the plans for Ebbets Field in early January of 1912. There are multiple stages in building a ballpark, including site acquisition, site preparation, the actual construction, and the financing. Of all of his peers who built a ballpark from scratch, there were some and had to acquire the land. Some of the ballparks in that period were built on existing sites, so it wasn't as complicated. But Ebbets had by far, whether it was site acquisition, site preparation, whether in the construction period, he had by far the most complicated process, the most difficult process. He had to acquire 30 parcels of land, whereas the most any other owner had to acquire was something like 6. And the site that he acquired, when he acquired the site, when he made the announcement, most people thought that was coming. What they were surprised at was the site, and when they went to the site, the reason they were surprised was because it was very hard to visualize the site as a ballpark. It was not level ground. It had to be raised 16 feet on one end and lowered 16 feet on the other end in order to become level, and he had to do that in one of the worst winters in New York history. So all of that caused major delays, and the ballpark that he hoped to open in August of 2012 wasn't open until April of 1913. And even then they were scrambling to get it together at the end.
And you made a reference earlier to a mistake that he made in the planning or design of Ebbets Field. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. The thing that I learned about Ebbets is that his greatest weakness was either his inability or his unwillingness to think long term. And there are plenty of examples of that. His personal life was a mess because of that of decisions made in that way. But when it came to the ballpark, he made a major mistake in how he made 2 mistakes. One was to act as the general contractor himself, but that one was not an irreversible damage. But the other was that when you build a big real estate project like that, it's not unlike buying a home. The first thing you do, buying or building a home, the first thing you do is you get a mortgage, you get your long-term financing in place, and then you work backwards. Well, for whatever reason, Ebbets never did that. He didn't have the long-term financing in place when he started the process, and Ebbets never had a lot of money. And by the summer of 1912, he's running out of money, and he's literally going to the different owners hoping to borrow money from them, and they're not willing to do that. Finally, there's only one alternative. The alternative is to bring in some additional owners, and so he brings in Ed and Steve McKeever as his partners. And the McKeevers were I would say Steve McKeever was not the most competent and one of the more difficult people. Ed McKeever was probably more competent, but the problem wasn't so much that. It was that they became 50-50 partners, and that seemed to work all right as long as the three of them were alive. But there was no arrangement made for deadlock resolution. What do you do if the two sides can't agree on something? Nor were any plans made as to what happens when the original owners die. And unfortunately, Ebbets dies in April of 1925, and Ed McKeever at Ebbets' funeral catches a cold that leads to pneumonia, and he's dead within a month. So that leaves the club owned 50% by Ebbets' heirs, who are a very contentious group of people whose primary goal is to get money out of the ball club. And the McKeever heirs, including Steve McKeever, who was a very difficult individual to deal with. At his first ownership meeting representing the club, he offends the league president and a number of the owners. So that you can see that's not going to end well. And so the Ebbets and McKeever heirs for the next 20 years, or maybe not quite that long, until Larry McPhail becomes involved. They fight and almost destroy the ball club, and the ballpark falls into disrepair. So that was Ebbets. That was the mistake he made. If he had his financing in place for the building of Ebbets Field, then he wouldn't have needed the McKeevers, and none of that would have happened.
And potentially the Dodgers might still be in Brooklyn.
It certainly went in that direction. There's no question of that.
Yeah, and as you were talking about the heirs, also another thing that struck me, as you said, they were primarily interested in money. I always had the impression, just from what little I've read about the McKeevers, that, they loved the game, but it was a business investment for them. So, among all the heirs, it seems like there was nobody that had anything remotely like the passion for the game as a sport and as an institution that Charles Ebbets did.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, as we said at the beginning, Ebbets was a baseball lifer.
Yep.
He said on more than one occasion, "I'm not in baseball for my health." But he also he did a lot of things. I believe that Ebbets' lasting contribution to the Brooklyn Dodgers is the laying the foundation for the close relationship between the Dodgers and their fans, which takes full fruit with the boys of summer of the late 1940s through their departure after 1957. But I think that foundation was laid by Ebbets, who on multiple occasions made a decision that was not in his best interest financially, because he was committed to his fans. And probably the best example of that is that for most of 1907, Ebbets was in a fight with Ned Hanlon and Ferdinand Abel, who were minority partners in the Dodgers, who wanted to throw Ebbets out and presumably move the franchise to Brooklyn. And Ebbets knew that his only real solution was to buy them out, but of course he didn't have the money to do that. He didn't have a very good team, but he had a couple of players that the New York Giants wanted, and they were willing to pay $30,000 for those two players, which doesn't sound like much today, but it was a fortune then. And Ebbets could have taken that money and bought out the other two, and he was urged by his lawyer to do that. But he ultimately said, "I'm not going to do that, because then it's not fair to the fans." And that's just one example of that connection that he built, that the people of Brooklyn, that gave them the ownership of the club and the ballpark too, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, one of the quotes I've posted on one of the Brooklyn Dodger pages that I administer, Branch Rickey saying it was a crime against a community of 3 million people to move the Dodgers. And, compared to any other defunct sports franchise, I mean, can you think of any other defunct franchise that has remotely the following, the ongoing passion, the ongoing sense of outrage over the loss of their team more than 60 years later?
No, it's not even close.
Yeah.
If you look at one of the best examples is probably the New York Giants, which certainly was a very good baseball team for a very long time. And there's nothing there. I mean, there are people. I mean, it's not like there's nobody. There's a New York Giants Preservation Society, but it's nowhere near as active as the Brooklyn Dodgers. And the way I like to say it is that even though the Dodgers and Ebbets Field are gone forever, they will never die. And Ebbets it never would have happened without Charles Ebbets.
Right. Something else that you mentioned in passing and that I think, looking back on the story of the Brooklyn Dodgers is kind of sad. This magnificent showpiece, the crowning achievement of his career as an owner in so many ways, Ebbets Field, that for so much of its brief life, it really suffered from neglect, in those years after Ebbets' death and before Larry McPhail came in and as part of his effort to revitalize the club, really spruced up the park. But then even in the final years, I have the impression, Branch Rickey's philosophy was put money into the product on the field. That's what matters. And then once Walter O'Malley forced Branch Rickey out, he didn't want to put any significant money into the ballpark because he was angling for a new park and making Ebbets Field more attractive and more functional. I would assume just would have gone against his longer range goal, which is really tragic in a lot of ways.
It is. I mean, certainly it's true that the ballpark was the fights in the 20s and 30s really hurt the ballpark, and while there were some refurbishing of it under McPhail, I unfortunately never got there, but I've heard that that it wasn't, a lot of it wasn't very attractive. Now, I think that's also, though, probably fairly typical of the ballparks of that era. Most of the ballparks that were built in the dead ball era continued through the 1950s and early 1960s, and I'm going to guess that was probably true of them as well.
None of the modern amenities, and yet on my Brooklyn Dodger pages on Facebook and other places, just this very sweet memories that people had being so close to the game, so close to the players. I'll see men in their 70s and 80s saying, I never saw grass as green as the grass at Ebbets Field. And I'm sure part of that is, kind of the romance of remembering our youth and our heroes of our past. But, me too, I'm very sad I never had a chance to see a game there. John, could I ask you to venture an opinion if you'd be willing? We've mentioned other names of Dodger executives, McPhail, Rickey, and O'Malley, and all of them are in baseball's Hall of Fame, and yet Charles Ebbets is not. And, I'll just throw out my feeling that given his record of innovation in baseball and his lifetime contributions, I think, you could make a very strong case for him as a significant executive who also deserves that honor. Your thoughts?
I certainly agree with that. I think a case can definitely be made for Ebbets as being worthy of the Hall of Fame. If you look at the owners in the Hall of Fame, there are not a lot of them, and a number of them, like Charles Comiskey and Connie Mack, were either great players or great managers as well as being owners. So you don't see a lot of just pure owners. The most recent one, who was a contemporary of Ebbets, was Barney Dreyfuss, the longtime owner of the Pirates. And if you look at his record as an owner, I think his teams won 6 pennants compared to 4 for Ebbets, although they did win 3 World Series. He built a ballpark that lasted as long or a little, I guess, even longer than Ebbets Field. If he's worthy, I think Ebbets would certainly be worthy. But I also get the feeling that that owners just don't get a lot of, especially the further they get out of mind, they don't get a lot of attention.
That's a shame. So, John, let me ask you this. I mean, do you think now with authoring 2 books on the subject and editing another, do you think you've exhausted the Brooklyn Dodgers as a book subject, or might there be another one in your future?
I would say that the probabilities are that I'm done. It's such a, especially a biography is such a long process. It really is it makes it's difficult. Charles Byrne, the founding president of the Dodgers, might be a good topic for a biography. But the way I feel right now, I'm not. I have a book coming out in the spring or in June about early New Jersey baseball. The way I'm thinking right now is that's probably going to be my last book, and I'll devote whatever writing I do after that to blogs, to my blog and things like that. So.
Okay. Well, I'll be looking for that book as well, and thank you for, what I consider really a significant contribution to Brooklyn Dodger history. I think we tend to maybe focus more on the Boys of Summer era because that was certainly the greatest success the Dodgers enjoyed on the field and such memorable men and memorable times. But, the whole history of the franchise is really, to me, very rich, very interesting, and you've contributed an important addition to the literature.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
All right, our guest today on Ask Claire, John Zinn, the author of Charles Ebbets, the man behind the Dodgers and Brooklyn's beloved ballpark, from McFarland Publishing, and you can find it on McFarland's website or Amazon's website, and I'm sure in many bookstores. So thank you for listening, and until we meet again, happy trails.